morning, and thank you all for coming today. My name is Kiri Lamack, and I'm the director of the Homeland Security Project here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and we're glad to see you all here. The BPC's Homeland Security Project is co-chaired by former Governor Tom Kean and former Congressman Lee Hamilton, and it has as a core mission to be an active bipartisan voice on homeland and national security issues. We also are glad to have in the audience today one of the Homeland Security Project members, John Gannon, up here in front. Today's event is part of an important discussion, and we're very glad to have such an esteemed panel with us. As we've all seen recently, the threat facing our nation is not going away. As we predicted in our report on online radicalization that we released this past December, we need to use all the tools at our disposal to meet and thwart that threat. One tool in particular is the reason we've gathered here today. The use of drones, which are unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs, has become the center of a brewing controversy. Today we'll hear from a number of former government officials, activists, and current reporters who are experts in the legal issues surrounding the use of drones and targeted killings. We're going to hear their thoughts on how our nation needs to frame the discussion. To kick things off, I'm very pleased to welcome current Homeland Security Project co-chair and former Governor Tom Kean to the podium. Governor Kean, working alongside former Congressman Lee Hamilton, has provided extraordinary bipartisan leadership in creating a safer, more secure nation, and we're thrilled to have him here today to introduce today's discussion. Governor Kean.
Gary, thank you. Thank you very, very much. Both Lee Hamilton and I are very proud to be part of the Bipartisan Center. They're addressing all sorts of questions now, from energy and debt reduction to housing and health and democracy. And believe me, I think you know, never has bipartisan approach to these subjects been needed more. So Lee and I are just very proud to be part of this center and to head this project on Homeland Security. Now, one of the great challenges that we're all facing is the use of drones and targeted killings. It's a real challenge. Now, we have to talk about how to engage our enemies abroad and respond to imminent threats here at home. We've always done that in the past in this country through some sort of a legal framework. And we need that legal framework in order to have this kind of discussion. Now, another thing Lee Hamilton and I agree on is that one of the keys to our great democracy is transparency. Well, we recognize that the use of drones and targeted killings is a very difficult subject. It's one that the American public deserves to have its leaders tackle, and we have to tackle it in a transparent method. We got some wonderful people here today to talk about this with you. Experts who are going to delve deeper into the myriad questions raised by our government's use of drones and targeted killings. These are wonderful panelists who represent an array of opinions and will offer their thoughts on how best to create this kind of legal framework and how to administer these kind of programs. At a time when technology is continuing to evolve and the threat to our nation, as we well know, is continuing to evolve, we must stay ahead of both. That means our capabilities must continually improve. And it also means that the actions we take must result in a solid legal foundation for those actions. The government has a responsibility to keep us safe and secure. That's the number one responsibility. And keep safe our democratic way of life. But they have to do so consistent with our laws and with our traditions. I'd now like to invite my friend Mike Hurley, President of Team 3 and a long-term advisor to myself and to Lee Hamilton, a very important member of the 9/11 staff, and a moderator for today's discussion, to introduce our panelists. Mike is also an attorney, and I think may have seen a drone or two in his time. Mike.
Governor Kean, thank you so much for the kind words. Today's subject is drones and the rule of law and war. Our procedures are simple and straightforward. We will hear from our panel members. I'll ask some questions, and then I'll open it up to you in the audience. More on that when the time comes. To call this An all-star panel is a bit of an understatement. Our panelists are a constellation of national security experts who have thought and reflected deeply on the issues at hand today. Among them, I sort of feel like a guy who splashes paint on houses about to talk about subtle aspects of portraiture painting with a group of Rembrandts. Let me begin by introducing the panelists. Seated next to me on my left is John Bellinger. John is a partner at the law firm of Arnold & Porter. He is a former legal advisor to the U.S. State Department and former legal advisor to the National Security Council. He speaks and writes regularly on public international national security law issues. Recently, John testified before the House Committee on the Judiciary, subject, Drones and the War on Terror, when can the U.S. target alleged American terrorists overseas? John, so happy to have you here. Seated to John's left is Hina Shamsi. Hina Shamsi is the director of the ACLU's National Security Project, which is dedicated to ensuring that the U.S. national security policies and practices are consistent with the Constitution, civil liberties, and human rights. She has litigated cases challenging targeted killings. Her work includes a focus on the intersection of national security and counterterrorism with international human rights and humanitarian law. She is a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. Next to Hina is Philip Zelikow. Dr. Philip Zelikow is the Associate Dean of the University of Virginia's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, former counselor to the Secretary of State, U.S. Department of State. He was the Executive Director of the 9/11 Commission. He has served on national commissions and task forces and written books too numerous to mention. He is currently a member of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, where I dare say the word drone has been mentioned once or twice. Philip, welcome. And then Mark Mazzetti. Mark is a national security correspondent for the New York Times. He is a co-winner of the Pulitzer Prize for reporting on the intensifying violence in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Washington's response. He is author of a recently published book, The Way of the Knife, The CIA, A Secret Army and a War at the Ends of the Earth, which is right on point to our discussion this morning. Here's the book. I recently read it, and I commend it to you all. Let's dive right into the subject at hand, and I'd like to turn to John Bellinger. John, you've been in the arena on so many of these issues, and if you could begin by just framing some of them for us, the sort of legal and policy aspects.
Sure. Thanks, Mike, and thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center for putting this together. When I testified, as Mike said, before the House Judiciary Committee a couple of weeks ago, I both started and ended my testimony with a plea for more bipartisanship. As we all know, one of the saddest byproducts of 9/11 has been that national security issues have become so divisive when we really ought to be pulling together. And Republicans do this to Democrats, and Democrats do it to Republicans, and drones is yet another one of those. I was, in fact, I guess, present at the creation, at least, of the legal basis for the use of drones. I was in the White House in the summer of 2001 when we developed the Armed Predator and were thinking about using it against al-Qaeda leaders, in fact, bin Laden, if we could find him. And so I was responsible for developing the legal framework. So I do think, as a general matter, that it is permissible under both domestic law, under the now subsequently developed Authorization to Use Military Force Act, and under international law for the United States to use drones to kill al-Qaeda leaders who are planning attacks against us. So the main legality of the program, as both the Bush administration and the Obama administration have practiced it, I think, are correct. The devil, though, is in the details, and the problem is we don't know a lot of the details. I think the Obama administration would never have guessed 4 years later that they would now be being accused of war crimes, have the ACLU suing them, having the UN rapporteurs at the Human Rights Council conducting investigations of whether the Obama administration is committing war crimes and violating international law. A British group has sued the British government for supposedly sharing intelligence with the Obama administration, resulting in the death of a man in Pakistan. So 4 years later, the Obama administration is now finding some of the same charges that were leveled against the Bush administration. A couple of years ago, I did write an op-ed in the Post called, "Will Drone Strikes Become Obama's Guantanamo?" And at the time, I was being a little bit provocative and I was really trying to nudge this administration to do a better job of explaining the legal basis of what they were doing, the policy basis, and to be more transparent. At the time I wrote that, I didn't actually really think that drone strikes could become Obama's Guantanamo. I now think that really is seriously at risk. This has become a real problem for them. I do know they are grappling very hard with the issue. They have, through a number of officials, John Brennan, Harold Koh, others have issued a series of speeches that have been quite good, generally explaining the program. But the problem is, and this is my real point here, is no other country in the world has at least publicly agreed with the legality of our drone program. That's not a good place for the United States to be. Now, it may well be that there are a handful who are cooperating with us who quietly believe that it's legal or they wouldn't be cooperating. But right now, the United States is isolated, as the Obama administration has launched more than 300 drone strikes in 4 different countries, killing more than 3,000 people. And the rest of the world is finding this very controversial, if not unlawful. They've given the Obama administration the benefit of the doubt for 4 years, but as we now go into a second term, I think they are now beginning to become increasingly restive, and the challenge for the Obama administration, just frankly as it had been for us when we entered the second term of the Bush administration, is now to try to convince the rest of the world that what they are doing in terms of counterterrorism policy is in fact lawful. So they are rapidly on the back foot. The Obama administration, I know they are working at this inside the White House, needs to do a better job explaining the legality of the program, who they are targeting, why it's lawful, and why the rest of the world should in fact agree with what they're doing. So in a moment I'd be happy to get into more of the legal details, but that's sort of where we are right now.
Thanks, John. Hina.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you very much to the Bipartisan Policy Center for having this event and for inviting me. So let me start out in the spirit of the center with agreeing with a lot of what John Bellinger has said. The targeted killing program raises profoundly important legal, moral, and policy questions. And right now, the public debate with respect to those questions is crippled because we don't actually have a lot of the information that we need in order to determine the full extent of where the program's being carried out, how, against whom, with what investigation, and what measures to prevent harm to civilians. Let me also start out with another point of agreement. Often a straw man is created, the idea that people are against drones per se, and some people may very well be. As a legal matter, I don't think drones are per se unlawful, but as a policy matter, they raise profoundly, again, important questions because they are easier to use without risk to U.S. forces. And they may be able to be used in places where we are not otherwise at war, as has been explained to the American public where we are at war. But there becomes also a legal issue when you talk about who is using the drones. It has been widely reported that the CIA is using drones. You know, the idea that the CIA's drone program is secret is one of the worst kept secrets in the world. It undermines our legitimacy to make that claim. But it takes us to the question of how are we using this weapon or any other weapon, because helicopter airships have also been used to carry out the program of targeted killing. And that's really what I think the heart of this debate is about. What we know is deeply troubling, and I think there is general agreement amongst international law scholars that the use of lethal force is permissible under international law, human rights law, in response to may be permissible in response to a specific, concrete, and imminent threat. In the law of war context, when you're in an actual armed conflict, it would be permissible against civilians who are directly participating in hostilities as those terms are defined under the laws of war and as long as other law of war requirements are met. What has been made public in speeches by administration officials, and I do appreciate and respect that those speeches have been made, as well as the white paper that was first leaked, is that those aren't the standards that are being applied. If you look at the white paper alone, and remember this is a white paper that was purportedly a summary of a legal memo used to justify the killing of a U.S. citizen who's a senior operational al-Qaeda leader, or alleged to be one. The restrictions that the white paper recognizes, for example, on what constitutes an imminent threat, feasibility of capture, law of war requirements, when you read the white paper, you realize that what appear to be limitations are in fact permissions. So it turns out that the senior high-level official who is making the determination about whether lethal force may be used does not need to have, for imminence to exist, according to the white paper, actual evidence that a plot is going to take place. And all of a sudden, the imminence requirement is read out of existence. It's vastly expansive, vastly elastic. And something similar happens with respect to the requirement and capture. And where we are now is recognizing that the requirements that, at least what we know with respect to U.S. citizens, raise at least significant concerns, from our perspective far more than that, about whether the legal requirements are being abided by. And if we have that concern with U.S. citizens, we should equally have that concern with non-citizens. One U.S. citizen has reportedly been publicly targeted. 3 others have been otherwise killed. But as Senator Graham said, there are reports that approximately 4,700 non-citizens have been killed. And I think that there are fewer things that are more likely to undermine the legitimacy of our country as well as our national security than even the perception that we are not abiding by the rule of law with respect to non-citizens as well as our own citizens alike, and that we are indifferent to civilian casualties. So what do I think needs to happen at a minimum with respect to transparency? At a minimum, disclosure of the legal standards with respect to who can be targeted, what is the process by which those decisions are made, who is a senior high-level official, who reviews the decision-making of senior high-level officials, and who should the American public hold accountable? Who are the militants or the civilians who have been killed? To the extent that the numbers are known, those numbers should be disclosed. To the extent that identity is known, that should be disclosed as well. We will not be able to move forward with the kind of debate that we expect of ourselves, of any liberal democratic society, one based on checks and balances, without that fundamental transparency which is necessary to accountability, not just in courts, but public accountability in the public sphere.
Hinna, thank you. Philip Zelikow, your views.
Thanks. I have to first explain that because I'm a member of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, A, I'm a bit constrained in what I can say about this program publicly, but at the same time, B, I'm actually not here as a representative of the administration, and nothing I'm saying should be construed as representing the views of anyone in the Obama administration. So between those 2 pillars, let me try to navigate a path. What I'd like to try to do is just take a moment and explain to you an argument about how to conduct warfare in this strange way. The United States has been involved in a global armed conflict with al-Qaeda and its affiliate organizations now for approximately 15 years. Al-Qaeda knew it was engaged in that global armed conflict before the United States government agreed that it was in it. But al-Qaeda was able to forcefully impress on the United States government that it was in such a conflict, probably most strikingly beginning in August of 1998. All right. So here we are 15 years later, and we're talking about whether that conflict can be conducted with remotely piloted vehicles in many countries around the world. Okay. Let me offer you two different paradigms for how to think about this problem. Now, in these paradigms, I'm going to try to make this very clear, and maybe too clear. You need to do three things. First, you need to define what's the doorway through which I must enter that allows me to kill these people. What's the doorway? Second, having passed through that doorway, I have to define which people I can legally kill as a government. Third, having defined that, I must set some sort of standards of evidence and circumstances under which people so defined can be targeted. Okay? Now, there are two contrasting approaches for how to answer all three of these sets of questions. One approach I'll call an armed conflict / law of war approach, which I support. The second is what I would call a constitutional / self-defense approach, which worries me deeply. Let me just explain the way these two approaches work. For the doorway, if you're in an armed conflict approach, the doorway is and must be a public doorway. The country knows and discusses that it has entered into this armed conflict. The Congress debates it. The Congress indeed may pass an authorization for the use of military force expressly authorizing the government to wage war against its enemies around the world. This is a healthy attribute of a democracy. Under the constitutional approach, the doorway is some entity or person poses an imminent threat to the United States that allows us to defend ourselves. That doorway need not be public. That determination can be concluded in secret, whether or not the government has determined that it is in an armed conflict with some larger entity, and that this, in other words, rises to the stature of a war or warlike thing, rather than being a person or group of people who are dangerous to us in our secret determinations. So you can see the significance of these paradigms, and if you parse the administration public statements on this issue, you'll see references to both of these paradigms. What you're hearing from me is a strong argument about the significance of one and the dangers of the other. Now, the second standard I mentioned, what about the definition of the people whom you can kill? Under a law of armed conflict standard, I must say the Bush administration badly mangled this definition, and indeed did quite a lot to discredit it. It expanded the definition of the term enemy combatant to include a lot of anyone who had given or might even be seen to have given some sort of material support to a terrorist organization, equating it with other standards in U.S. domestic law, often in the context of a Guantanamo litigation, like Boumediene, in which I took a part later after I was out of government. That's very pernicious, because the enemy combatant standard is very important. An enemy combatant is someone whom our military can lawfully kill or capture without a lot of advance notice. So that's a determination that should be approached with care. Now, properly defined, an enemy combatant is someone who, as international law experts would put it, is directly participating in hostilities. Indeed, this is sometimes called the DPH standard. To its credit, the Obama administration has publicly endorsed the DPH standard to defining enemy combatants, and in my view, therefore, has restored credibility to that kind of approach. Credibility that was tattered when the Obama administration entered office. In the constitutional paradigm, the definition of who can be killed doesn't use necessarily these law of war determinations and doesn't judge whether that person is a member of the larger entity with whom you're engaged in the armed conflict. Instead, it simply parses information about that individual and the threat posed by that individual. By the way, you'll notice that while that, I think, is potentially pernicious in some ways, it also at the same time begins assuming an extraordinarily high standard of intelligence and evidence about particular individuals that is rarely attainable in practice. Then at the third level, that is, what evidence and circumstances you need, we have a great deal of experience and a lot of people who are well trained on the application of the DPH standard in enemy combatants as a result of 15 years of warfare. This is now a standard that a lot of people understand and know how to apply, and they know how to second-guess mistaken applications of it. We've had a lot of trial and error with this. We have some seasoning and how to make judgments about this. In the constitutional standard, because it'll turn then on evidence and circumstances so related to this individual determination, assuming that the government involved is one of goodwill and does not want to abuse its privileges, it's going to want to set very high evidentiary standards in the best case. The irony then is, I look back, for instance, on the years around 9/11, is there is a level at which we're a little spoiled about the intelligence we might have about certain people in areas we've been watching very closely now for a long time, areas that we now know better than people living in Fairfax County know the street map of Arlington. I'm serious. So don't assume that that evidentiary standard is going to be met in other situations we'll encounter. That evidence may look a lot more like the pre-9/11 story, where if you read the 9/11 Commission report, you'll see all kinds of uncertainties about, is someone there, who else is there, judgments had to be made, repeated questions came up in 98 and 99, should we shoot? And in every case, after the first, the decision was made not to shoot, for reasons that in retrospect some might question. So now step back. I'm basically offering a paradigm, you'll notice, that is very public about how you get in, applies fairly well understood standards about how you work it, but then takes into account the inherent uncertainties of warfare in making judgments about when you can strike. But that's because the country has decided it's in a war and can debate that decision. In the other paradigm, a pure constitutional paradigm, you can bypass an AUMF, you don't need an AUMF. You can make these constitutional determinations, and indeed you go in ways that may be less visible to the public, less open to debate about with whom we should be at war, yet then simultaneously, partly because of that, impose standards of evidence on you that actually make it harder to deal with the sorts of enemies we may encounter in the future, whether it might be, what would we have liked to have been able to do in Libya last year if we had had just a little more information than the information we had, and it had more assets on the scene. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Philip. Mark, you've thought deeply about these issues and investigated them. Could you give us the benefit of your thinking?
Thanks, Mike. It's terrific to be here. And I was a last-minute addition to the panel when the original Rembrandt, Daphne Linzer, was going to be here. But I'm honored to pinch hit and to be on this panel. I come at this subject differently than everyone up here. I'm the only person who's not a lawyer up here. Even the former CIA guy's a lawyer. But it's I'm a reporter and a national security reporter. When fundamentally we're trying to get at basic questions about what is happening now and what has happened in the past on these issues. And I see some in Ken Delanian in the audience from the LA Times, where we're all sort of basically trying to ask the same questions and get some answers. What I do in my reporting for the New York Times and also in my book is try to basically describe as much as possible the history of this secret war that's been waged since 9/11, as Philip points out, since before 9/11, because it really is a war, and it really has been in secret since those early years. And I think by now we sort of know the broad outlines and the contours of the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, but what is happening and what has happened in Pakistan, what is happening and what has happened in Yemen, and other parts, places like Somalia, still, I think, those stories need to be told, and that's what I've been trying to do. I agree with Hina that we do focus, and some of it's the media's fault, on the idea of drones as a weapon, because there is the science fiction quality to it. There is this aspect of, although they're not robots, this idea of killer robots carrying out this kind of war. And I think it's legitimate to write about them, and it's legitimate to talk about this kind of way of war. But the deeper question is obviously how they're used, and the idea of targeted killing or not so targeted killing in places where, at least officially, the United States is not at war. So that's what I've written about, is the how this way of war has become sort of the default way that the United States does its business. Certainly was begun by the Bush administration, and over time, if we're looking at targeted killing, the Bush administration went from primarily a capture strategy and interrogation strategy to, after a few years, start the detention and interrogation program, especially when the CIA really started to tail off. The targeted killing really started to escalate, and the Obama administration came in 2009 and not only embraced it but expanded it in many ways. So as a reporter, it's been very it's been, I think, the most important story is to sort of understand how the Obama administration sees this way of war, how it has conducted this way of war, and really what it has meant for not only American policy, but also the question of will there be repercussions to how or blowback to this war being conducted. John mentioned earlier that he thought that using drones to kill Al-Qaeda leaders is certainly lawful, and he supported it. And I think that what we see these days, in many cases, is drones being used on targets that are far from senior Al-Qaeda leaders. And in many ways, Al-Qaeda as it existed on 9/11 is a shadow of what it was. And so the real questions that we have to ask are things like, what is the bar for targeted killing? Who is being targeted? Is it Al-Qaeda? Is it Al-Qaeda affiliates? Are they enemies of the state of Pakistan? Are they enemies of the state of Yemen? Is the United States the sort of counterinsurgency air force for Yemen or Pakistan? I mean, these are questions that I think are being answered, but obviously we still need to know more about, because if this really is the default way of doing business, if we don't expect to see another Afghanistan anytime very soon, or another Iraq anytime very soon, but to see a lot more Yemens, Pakistans, and Somalias, then I think probably everyone up on this panel agrees that there does need to be greater transparency on these issues, greater public discussion on these issues, and sort of greater accountability for how the war is being waged. I still find it striking that, as a reporter, when recently I was covering the John Brennan confirmation hearings, when John Brennan was being confirmed for the CIA director, to find that I was struck to find that the members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, who are the dozen people in Congress who are authorized to have the highest level of most classified levels of intelligence inside the government, do not have the memos, the legal memos that are underpinning the targeted killing program. Now, the White House sort of makes a point that Congress isn't entitled to them. Congress believes they are. I think as an outsider, it is striking to me that the members of the Intelligence Committee, a committee that was formed after the Church Committee investigations of the 70s to provide oversight over the CIA and other secret agencies, don't have these memos. And I think, in my own perspective, is not having those memos does significantly limit their ability to conduct oversight. So I think that if that's the position they're in, I think it's a lot tougher for citizens, people who are not in government, to really make informed judgments about what we think about these things. And I hope for more and more discussion in the future.
Mark, thanks very much. John and Hina, and I invite you to react or respond to the two paradigms that Philip Zelikow laid out, and just what your reaction to that is and how it advances analysis.
Yeah, I was actually going to respond a bit to Philip and take a slightly different angle, although I see what he's saying and agree. Let me say, a couple of things about what the debate, I think, is really not about. As Hina said, although we talk a lot about drones, the problem is not the use of drones. People now start saying, well, the problem really is targeted killings. It's actually not the problem is targeted killings. If we are in a real war, if we're in war with Germany or Japan in World War II and we had developed a weapon in which one could only kill a single person rather than engage in mass bombings in Dresden, everybody would say, that's wonderful, that's legal, that's good. So it's not actually that targeted killings are bad. Targeted killings, when they are lawful and legitimate, can be good. The issue really here, and this begins to fit with what Philip is saying, is that there is a fundamental disagreement around the world, which I experienced when I was a legal advisor, as to whether the United States really is in a war at all. And we are about the only country in the world that really thinks that we are in an armed conflict with al-Qaeda. I spent 4 years as legal advisor in the Bush administration engaged in a dialogue that was actually really kicked off by the 9/11 Commission. One of the 9/11 Commission recommendations was that we needed to work with our allies to develop common standards, in those cases for detention, based on Common Article 3. What's now going on around the world is just a different debate with the rest of the world about not detention, because, as Mark said, this administration has decided that they don't want to do detention anymore. The Bush administration got into trouble with detention, so they're now going to just kill people. So instead of detaining members of al-Qaeda, they're killing members of al-Qaeda. The issue, though, is not the targeted killings. The issue around the world, and I see a number of members of different embassies here, is the United States in an armed conflict around the world? Can you be in an armed conflict with a group? Can you be in an armed conflict with a group that goes on not just in one country, in Afghanistan, but in a whole lot of different countries? And through successive administrations, the Bush administration and the Obama administration have been unable to persuade our allies that after the initial phases of the Afghan war, that the United States remains in an armed conflict with al-Qaeda that allows us, therefore, to use lethal force against members of al-Qaeda around the world. And this is where what I'm talking about fits together with what Philip is talking about. From the rest of the world perspective, it's not the law of war versus U.S. constitutional law, because other countries really don't care that much about U.S. constitutional law. They apply a paradigm of human rights law. They don't think that we are in a war, and therefore, to the extent that the United States may use force lawfully under international law, one has to apply a human rights law paradigm, meaning that one can only target someone who poses an absolutely imminent threat. Under a human rights law paradigm, other countries, other international lawyers would say yes. If bin Laden can be shown to be sitting in Pakistan about to launch an attack, and Pakistan is unwilling to do anything about it, then yes, the United States may act in self-defense. But there is a stark contrast between our view in the United States that we are in a war with al-Qaeda where we can kill members of al-Qaeda no matter really where they are, and the rest of the world's perspective, which is that the United States is not in a war, and they were very surprised to find the Obama administration adopt this armed conflict paradigm, that European countries in particular thought was going to be dropped like a hot potato as soon as the Obama administration came into office, and to not only continue the war paradigm, but actually to ramp up the use of drones. So I agree with Philip that at least from a U.S. versus international perspective, there are two paradigms. I would say it is a law of war paradigm that we're applying versus not a constitutional paradigm, but a human rights law paradigm from the rest of the world.
So generally, I think one way to think about it is that the constitutional standards and the human rights standards are very, very similar. And what the Constitution allows with respect, at least to U.S. citizens, is no question about the ability to invoke those rights in U.S. court. So let me set that aside a little bit and pick up from where John left off about how the rest of the world not only doesn't agree, but I think from our perspective, we have to be concerned about the precedent that we are setting for the rest of the world to follow. Not just with respect to the use of drones, but the legal framework that we are arguing in which we can conduct targeted killing, which, and I'll footnote this as well, and perhaps we can discuss this, I think in a very literal sense, when you're talking about what I think you all may have read of as signature strikes and such, there's real question about whether we're talking about targeted killing in a literal sense. But going back to the precedent-setting standard, there is no question that multiple other countries, non-state actors, will have access to drones, other technology. Whatever standard we are claiming to use today, we have to accept that other countries are going to cite back to us tomorrow. And while we can accept, as I think we all must, that terrorism is a global threat, the idea that we are engaged in a global war on terror, which allows an executive branch, regardless of which country's executive branch it is, to declare people unilaterally enemies of the state and order their killing without judicial review, before or after the fact, is one that we must at least debate and seriously consider whether that's the kind of world in which we want to live. It used to be that our country condemned what we now call targeted killing. It will be the case tomorrow that other countries will carry them out. We look to ourselves as a standard setter for international law, the rule of law. We undermine our own status, our legitimacy, and our ability to argue for a rule of law approach if we don't recognize that the limitations we want today, might want for others, are the ones that we have to recognize for ourselves. And there I want to just talk very, very quickly about some facts. The reality is, as Mark said, that the majority of the people who are being killed now are not senior-level al-Qaeda leaders. They are lower-level insurgents who do not necessarily pose a threat to the United States, but may pose a threat to Pakistan, Yemen, and other countries. So at the least we need more information and debate about where we are committed to being at war, why, and for what reasons, in order to be able to really have sound policy going forward on these issues and an informed public debate based on which U.S. people can let their policymakers know what their thoughts are.
Philip Zelikow, any response to what John or Hina have said?
I don't disagree entirely with John. No, he's right about the human rights paradigm that's out there. I think the two paradigms I'm describing are important in the American context. But reacting to both comments, I have to observe that countries under attack are the ones that get to decide whether they're at war or not. And whether or not that's a legal principle, I'll make that observation as a historian. Countries under attack will decide whether they are at war or not. And if they think they are at war, they will act accordingly. If terrorists came to Shanghai and blew up its leading buildings and killed thousands of Chinese citizens tomorrow, and it wouldn't matter what precedents we had set or what labels we had applied. If the Chinese thought that had come from people overseas, they would act as if they were at war, and they would use 100% of their available power to attack the people who had caused that, to the absolute limits of what was possible. So, and wherever those people were, they would do that. And frankly, so would any other government that felt a sense of responsibility to its citizens to the limits of its power.
Thank you for that, Philip. And just a few minutes, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, but I have just a couple more questions I'd like to pose myself. And Mark Mazzetti, we've talked about the legal aspects here and the legal frameworks. On the policy side, though, as well, too, does the use of drones and targeted killing, is it, when we think about the long term, potentially doing more harm than good? John Bellinger, I know you made a similar point towards the end of your recent testimony to Congress, so I'll come to you next. But kind of a brief answer, Mark, if you can.
I think that, you know, this is something that we will come to find out in the years ahead in terms of, as I said before, you know, blowback for what is being done now. You know, at this point, there is anecdotal evidence of, you know, radicalization happening as a result of drone strikes in Yemen and Pakistan. I mean, one of the more famous cases is in May of 2010 when Faisal Shahzad tried to blow up Times Square with a truck bomb and thankfully was not successful. But he went into court and said that the reason why he had tried to carry out this attack was because of the drone strikes in Pakistan. It's one example and it's one person. I know that John Brennan has given a speech in saying that there is very little, or if no, evidence of radicalization. I mean, I think that making firm judgments on what right now about the impact, I mean, it is a little dangerous. I think, though, that if the CIA is doing its job, they should be doing very thorough analysis from their analytics side about what the other side of the CIA, the operations side, is doing, and the impact that the drone strikes that predominantly still are being carried out by the CIA are having on the views of people in Pakistan and elsewhere. And will that mean more radicalization? Will it mean more attacks? And whether it's, you know, attacks directed by whatever's left of Al-Qaeda or things like the Boston bomber. You know, I mean, we still don't know too much about what motivated the two brothers to carry out that attack, but certainly I think we would probably all agree we may see more of that in the future, and so what does that mean?
And John Bellinger, just a very quick response.
Yeah,
I know you addressed this.
I did, although I was mostly quoting people more knowledgeable than myself, like Stan McChrystal, who probably knows more about insurgency in Afghanistan than anyone. I mean, I'm a lawyer, but my point there was to note that people who really are in the know are concerned that our use of drones, while certainly effective on one hand, you know, we certainly are, one can quibble about whether every last person ought to have been targeted, but we're certainly knocking out a lot of Al-Qaeda leaders. But are we reaching a point of diminishing returns? And General McChrystal's point was that we do not understand how much the United States is becoming hated around the region because of the use of drone strikes. And my concern as a lawyer who has to defend these around the world, and this responds briefly to Philip's point, is that we're also losing support amongst our allies in Europe who were really willing to give President Obama the benefit of the doubt in a way they were not willing to give President Bush. But as these drone strikes have really ramped up, the European publics, their parliaments, their journalists are beginning to put pressure on their governments to say, why aren't you saying anything about this? Are you sharing intelligence with the American administration? Aren't these things legal? So these are really echoes of Guantanamo. And so, yes, Philip is absolutely right that any country who is attacked has a right to decide if they think they are in an armed conflict. But it becomes a serious problem for the United States, who needs the support of our allies and who is committed to rule of law, if none of our allies really believe that we are in that armed conflict. And where Philip and I really worked very hard in the second term of the Bush administration was to get out and do a better job in the second term than we had done in the first term to try to engage our allies in dialogue, explain to them what we were doing, explain to them, for example, why one can detain people under the laws of war without charging them, which was something that was absolutely not accepted. And what this administration's problem is because they feel they have been on the side of the angels, that they haven't had to explain themselves. And that was exactly what had happened in the first term of our administration, is that we felt that we were on the side of the angels, didn't have to go out and explain ourselves. We had been attacked. Everybody ought to be behind us. We got into a deep hole. Philip and I and others worked hard in the second term to try to convince our allies that we were actually doing the right thing. This is exactly echoes of what happened. The Obama administration now finding itself maybe not in as deep a hole, and they've got more support of their allies, but they really need to get on top of this and explain to our allies why what they are doing is legal, why it is permissible under international law.
Philip, a very quick response from you, then Hina, just a quick response from you, because you've already touched on it slightly in talking about the total number of civilian deaths. Philip.
Yeah, I really think it's time for the country to have another public debate about the authorization for the use of military force that the Congress passed in the fall of 2001. That was 12 years ago. It's time now to take another look at that. I mean, that's the corollary of my argument, is the country it is time now to have a renewed debate about, are we still in a war, or should we move this into another paradigm that maybe treats this as something less than a global armed conflict because of a different size and character of the enemy that we face now? I think it's an appropriate time for that. If this year isn't the right time, 2014, as our posture in Afghanistan, which really was the catalytic event for which the congressional legislation was passed in the first place, as that begins to move into a different phase, I think we really are entering a period where it's time for some renewed public discussion of these issues, of what framework really is now appropriate for this particular set of people.
Philip, you've anticipated and answered very well a couple of questions that I had, so I'll skip those. Hina, if you would just have a quick comment on this issue.
A very quick comment. You know, last week the Senate Judiciary Committee subcommittee, headed by Senator Dick Durbin and Ranking Member Ted Cruz, had a very useful and telling hearing on these issues. And to the extent that folks haven't looked at some of the statements that were put forward there, I would urge you to do so. I think the issue, two issues. One is it's not just a question of the Obama administration explaining why it thinks what it is doing is lawful, because I don't think even with those explanations our allies in Europe or elsewhere in the world are going to agree that this war-based framework is one that accords with international law. And so we really have to think through the fact that we have to ratchet that down and abide by the laws of war, which I think allow us to maintain our security and do so in accordance with a set of standards that the rest of the world recognizes and that we helped establish. And what happens when we don't? Well, one of the testimonies that I thought was most powerful last week, and kudos to Senator Durbin and Senator Cruz for inviting for the very first time a young man to describe the human costs and consequences of targeted killing operations in Yemen. And this is an exceptional young man. He was someone who comes from a remote village in Yemen who was learned English and went to university as a result of U.S. scholarships, went to high school here for a year, sees himself as an ambassador of American values and principles to Yemen. And 6 days before his testimony, his mountain village was, drones were used to strike it. And what he had to say was that up until then, what people knew about the United States was based on his love of the country and his talk about American values and what it meant to him about this nation. And now what they know were drone strikes that killed someone that he and other people think could easily have been captured by Yemeni forces, and that instead of this capture, what resulted was death, fear, and a real backlash against the United States. So We need to hear more from the people who are actually impacted on the ground to inform what might otherwise be sterile legal arguments, and recognize that, as I think Stanley McChrystal said, General McChrystal said, that what may appear riskless to us here is, on the perspective of the people on the receiving end, very much like war. And that is part of what we are doing, and that's part of what we have to consider going forward, including about whether we want to expand AUMF authority at a time when the public is tired of the blood and treasure that has gone into war-based endeavors, and when our policymakers are telling us that Al-Qaeda and other organizations have been decimated. It's a debate we have to have. It's a debate we have to have more information to have an informed basis.
Thank you, Hina. I'd like to open it up to your questions now, and we do have microphones. When I recognize you, wait till the microphone comes. Then please state your name and organization. If you would like to direct the question to a particular panelist, please do so. John Gannon.
Thanks, Mike. John Gannon from Georgetown University. Great panel. I think John Bellinger mentioned that the administration, the Obama administration, is making efforts to clarify this issue. I've read those speeches, and it seems to me that what I've read is more of a rationalization for what we have done, rather than establishing a credible legal framework for where we need to go. So a couple of questions that come out of that. One is with regard to roles and responsibilities. If you look at, for example, the Awlaki killing, I think no one has any trouble with the imam, but when we got his 16-year-old son 2 weeks later, we learned that in fact that operation was not conducted by CIA, which supposedly of this, but by JSOC, which is, of course, Department of Defense. So on the issue of roles and responsibilities and accountability that comes out of that, what's the legal foundation for either of those agencies or departments to be involved, and how do we get that clarified so that we can have clearer policy and then embed that in law? And then the final point I make, a point that Hina has made, is about the international implications of all this from a legal standpoint. If you look at the migration of this technology, it is proliferating, so that it isn't just an issue of our values and the kind of standard we're going to represent to the world. Well, ultimately, we're going to be threatened by this technology ourselves if we do not establish international law that governs the use of this kind of this capability. So how do we move to embed in domestic law and then get into the international arena and establish international law that is going to rein in this? And by the way, I would comment that I would expect any president to use whatever capability is available to him or her at the time of an attack. But I also expect, and I think our history shows, that we usually do get our senses as time goes on, and we recognize we have to rein this in and discipline it and embed in law. Because we are a country, after all, of a rule of law. Thank you.
And in responding, if you could keep your responses concise so we can take as many questions as possible in the remaining time, John?
Yeah, but as I would expect from John Gannon, a great question. One, on the administration speeches, which you haven't read them, go read them. They really are good speeches as far as they go. And what I'm really arguing here is that they need to go farther to explain, for the multiple reasons that you've heard, the precise legal parameters, why it's lawful, if they want to persuade other countries to go along with us. And the administration, I think, has not felt that they need to do that, and they do. And also, if we want to constrain, as Hina said, and I agree, other countries from the use of drones, then we need to be extremely precise in what is a lawful use of lethal force and what would be an unlawful use of lethal force. I pity the poor State Department spokesman who could happen at any point this year when China or Russia uses a drone and the spokesman has to stand up and tap dance and say, well, that was actually an illegal targeted killing, or in contrast to all of our lawful targeted killings. And the reason that's going to be difficult is that we have not been precise. So that is a challenge for the administration to explain in more detail. On your last point, again, I see, actually, I've talked about the echoes of Guantanamo. In some ways, I see echoes of the CIA interrogation program, which was a reaction, perhaps an overreaction to 9/11. Now we have the drone strikes, again proposed by CIA, put the White House in a difficult position of saying no, but now need to maybe get these all on a better footing in the second term.
I'll just on the roles and missions point, John, I think the administration has made it clear that it intends to move towards greater reliance on the Department of Defense for the conduct of warfare in the 21st century. And I support that.
Just very quickly,
Mark,
let me just say that on this point, I mean, it was one of two recommendations of the 9/11 Commission that was not ultimately adopted, which was to take paramilitary functions out of the CIA and give it to the DoD. If anything, not only was it not adopted, but the opposite ended up occurring, where the CIA has become so much a paramilitary organization. The core of its mission is paramilitary, using drone strikes, targeted killings. The Counterterrorism Center has become sort of the beating heart of the agency. So we'll see. Philip is right that there's been indications that the administration wants to move back in the other direction. We'll just see what happens.
Thanks. Hina, please.
Anwar al-Awlaki is, there's no question, at the very least one of the most unsympathetic characters that you could have in connection with being a poster boy for some of these policies. But the reality is that we have to ask, if not Anwar al-Awlaki, what about the next US citizen? What about the person after that? And right now, the administration takes the position in response to our Transparency Freedom of Information Act lawsuits that we cannot confirm or deny that we actually carried out the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, let alone of his 16-year-old son. And with respect to our constitutional due process challenge, the administration takes the position that the killing of 3 U.S. citizens cannot be subject to judicial review because this is, in essence, a political question solely for the executive branch to decide. And I think that is, we obviously profoundly disagree, but I think that is a very dangerous proposition for a system of checks and balances that the executive branch may be able to unilaterally take the life of a U.S. citizen and not be subject to judicial review even after the fact.
Thank you, Hina. Sir, in the back.
Thank you very much. Dan Roberts from The Guardian. Thanks for a very interesting panel this morning. I had a question for John and for Philip. It's a sort of hypothetical question, but I hope it might sort of help me understand better the arguments for the legality, international legality. If Al-Qaeda was to get its hands on drone technology, unlikely, but if it were and were to use them to attack US military sites here or government offices involved in planning attacks, what would be the international legality of that, do you think? Given that the two arguments put forward, one is that the US is engaged in a sort of mutual act of war with Al-Qaeda, and the other being, if it's responding to an imminent threat. If Al-Qaeda was to sort of satisfy those two requirements, would that pass your test of international legality?
Philip, you want to respond to The Guardian?
So we're discussing warfare with remotely piloted vehicles against people who were waging warfare with directly piloted vehicles.
I'm not trying to defend the terrorizing.
No,
where they targeted military installations.
There's nothing in international law that prohibits people from going to war against the United States. There are consequences from it.
So it would be legal?
It would be legal to go to war, and it would be legal for us to wage war against the people who did that.
Governor Kaine?
As Philip knows, a historian, all through our history, when we've had wars, we've suspended civil rights. We've done things profoundly illegal. Sometimes regretted them afterwards, but that's what we've done during war. But we've never had a war that lasted 15 years. And the idea that you can be extra legal for this period of time and have a program like this, to me, that kills people, I try to follow this. I don't even know who authorizes it. I don't know if it's John Brennan. I don't know if it's a military man. I don't have any idea who it is, let alone a legal framework or what the rationale is for this kind of thing. And I worry very much that as this technology spreads, we have through our history been a refuge for revolutionaries. We've had people rebelling against their government, and we make a home for them here because we often support what they're doing because it's in favor of democracy. We've done that since our earliest days. Does that mean some other country has a right to target them on American soil? And I think there are profoundly troubling questions here unless we do get the kind of legal framework which you're asking for.
Ma'am, please. Yes. One moment.
I was in Pakistan in October as a guest of the Foundation for Fundamental Rights, interviewing a lot of the families impacted by the drone strikes, and it seemed quite apparent that the signature strikes that you mentioned, Hina, actually are quite a significant proportion of the strikes there. And I don't really understand what's the legal framework for that, because people keep using the word targeted killing. That is clearly not targeted killing. It's patterns of activity where they don't even know who the individuals are. So how is that justified?
Anyone wish to respond?
Do you want to start?
John?
Yeah.
I think that's one of the concerns, that even for those of us who think that some drone strikes are in fact legal, is how the signature strikes seem to fit the Obama administration's rationale, where on the one hand they have said, and the president has said, rather surprisingly, that he's personally approving drone strikes. At one point a year and a half ago, there were stories in the New York Times suggesting the president was personally poring over the target lists and approving them, and that they were reserving the targeting only for people who posed the most significant threat, senior al-Qaeda leaders. And that does seem to be inconsistent with the so-called signature strikes of people who bear a certain signature. So I think we don't know enough about what their rationale is because the Obama administration hasn't explained it. I'm not going to immediately criticize it because they haven't explained what they're doing for it to be criticized. But that gets to, I think, a point that almost all of us agree with, is that if we don't want to get further on the back foot around the world and inside the United States, the administration needs to explain who they're targeting and why and what the rules are, as John Brennan said, or John Gannon said.
It might be helpful just to take this out of the Pakistani context, about which I can't comment. Let's suppose you were talking about a signature strike against a Taliban encampment in Afghanistan. All right, everybody knows that the United States conducts military operations in Afghanistan against the Taliban. So then you might say, well, how do we know it's a Taliban encampment in Afghanistan? Well, there are intelligence indicators about things people have observed that cause people to conclude that it is an encampment of people directly participating in hostilities against our forces, and we make judgments. We have made hundreds, possibly thousands of those judgments in Afghanistan and Iraq without even getting into any place else in the world. Not all of those judgments are always accurate. In war, they never are. But there is an arcane terminology about signature strikes, and signature strikes, in a way, are the kinds of strikes that militaries conduct at war. And then you just get into the arguments as to what are the intelligence indicators that seem to provide compelling evidence that these are the people who are in combat against you.
Hina, if you'd make a quick comment.
Yes, I think very quickly, there are three major problems with signature strikes. One is, while I understand and agree that it's a form of lethal force operations that might be conducted in war, this is further away from what is colloquially referred to as a hot battlefield, and it's not clear that the administration is abiding by a direct participation in hostility standard, or even what the administration's definition is. And I was very struck when the former U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, Cameron Munter, was asked, what constitutes a militant who can be struck here? And he said, well, is it any male between 20 and 40? And he was pressed on that, and he said, well, one man's militant is another man's chump who went to a meeting. And the legal issue with signature strikes in this context, at least, is it threatens to turn the presumption of civilian status on its head. And civilians have a presumption in war and outside of it of not being targetable. And so I agree that we don't have enough information. We certainly need more information, but there's a real law of war threat if these are being conducted in the context of armed conflict, and many of them are not. Some of them may be. And the final concern is, how does that lead to the counting of civilian casualties? If people are categorized as militant versus civilian, and we don't know, as has been reported, that the CIA knows who it has killed until after they are dead, what are the counts? What is the basis? And how do we know? And what are the numbers? And we still don't know that.
John?
Can I just say, sort of listening to this last hour of conversation, I'm a little bit concerned that the pendulum is swinging a little bit too far in one direction. As somebody who actually was the legal advisor to the National Security Council both before and after 9/11, who responded to all of the 9/11 Commission's requests for what were you doing prior to 9/11 to make the country safe, and why didn't you do enough? I can tell you on behalf of someone who has been in the White House, these are difficult decisions. All these things, particularly that Hina has said, are on one side of the spectrum, and these drone strikes are causing us great damage around the world. On the other hand, if you are the President of the United States and his advisors sworn to make the country safe, your CIA director is giving you information that suggests that there are threats against you, that another 9/11 could happen, and you do nothing, then you also have a problem. And I'm sure this administration looks back and looks at the investigation done by the 9/11 Commission that suggested that not enough had been done, and is mindful of that. So I only want to make the point that although all of us have raised some concerns about drone strikes, I don't want the pendulum to swing so far as to suggest that these are not incredibly difficult decisions if you are the President of the United States and his advisors.
Thanks, John. I know there are many more questions out in the audience, but we're up against a hard deadline here in terms of time. And I'd just like to say that it's very difficult to summarize a panel like this because the issues are so complex, legal, policy, and moral, I think. But I do think that one thing that we all agree on here, and I think Philip made the point very well, that it's probably time to reconsider, revise the authorization for the use of military force, possibly also for broader discussions and a greater role, I'm hoping you all agree with this, for Congress in this. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors in terms of the Intelligence Committee oversight, but I think I reflect the views of the chairs of the 9/11 Commission that a greater role for Congress in all of this is important and will help educate the public. I'd like to ask Carrie LaMack to come up.
Thank you all again for coming today. Thank you, Governor Kaine and John Gannon and Congressman Hamilton, all the members of the Homeland Security Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center for putting together a great group that could put on this fantastic panel. Thank you, Mike, and all of our panelists. A special thank you to Alyssa Loy, Abby Brandon, and all of the communications team here at the BPC for putting together this fantastic event, and we hope to see you come again. We'll have a lot more discussions about very important topics, and as you can tell, I think that these issues are something that we need to keep the public focused on, so we appreciate you being here for part of this. Thank you.
You're in the legal.
I'm not actually.
No, okay.
You're a congressman.
Oh, I see.
I work very closely. Strange portfolio for my office. I work in security.
Okay.
As this hearing comes to a close, we want to let you know that on our companion network, C-SPAN 2, we will have a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on drone warfare. That'll be at 12:15 Eastern. Again, that'll be on C-SPAN 2. And as we look at the White House